Yes, next one, please. It all began 7 years ago in February in downtown Olympia when the city council had passed some relatively draconian measures having to do with the use of its sidewalks, which turned out to be, for us at that time, a severe impact on the homeless community who were using those sidewalks as their spots in the world. And they, with some political factors, there's no question that there were local advocates, not terribly organized, but there, who had actually formed something called the Poor People's Union at the time. And they got together and occupied a city lot in downtown Olympia. And set up tents and the whole thing. If we can go to the next slide. The process, of course, as you might imagine, with small town politics, it's a place where you know all the city council members by first name, etc. And we knew that those folks who were there knew there were some very ingrained resistances to this kind of activity. And in fact, within about 3 days, the city hall manager had, issued a proclamation that the cops were going to come in and sweep these people and their possessions away at any minute. And so, as this reached a head, representatives of the community there, which again included truly homeless folks and their political allies, sent a couple of students from our near university, Evergreen State College, to my church. And here's where another major component of our story happens. The faith community and its involvement. My church was the Unitarian Universalist congregation, and I was happy to be president of the board there at that time. And these students came to ask for sanctuary for this camp, which had come to call itself Camp Quixote. And there are some handouts in the back before I forget it, which tells a part of the story. But of course, Quixote is reference to Don Quixote of de la Mancha, Cervantes' story of an elderly, demented gentleman who was a knight, and who decided that windmills were his major enemy and would joust at them. And the other part of that story, I'll be introducing Ponza in a minute, but Ponza was his squire, the man who, in those kinds of stories, the only one with any sense who tries to keep his master out of trouble. And so you understand a little bit where that came from. In fact, in 2007, in Paris, there was a group called the Children of Don Quixote, who were doing exactly the same thing, of occupying city space with tents to protest homeless issues. So that's where the name came from, we think. But we can move on to the next slide. So in February 2007, they came to the church, who they knew had, first, we all already had a small shelter for homeless families, usually women with children, short-term and nighttime only at that point. But also we had space. It turned out that space used to be a wetland, and they didn't really discover that until they moved in. But we, after all the politics and decision-making within the church that you can imagine, in a congregation of 160 or 70 people, we unanimously said, do come. And that was the beginning of Camp Quixote. Part of what you should know about Camp Quixote is that from the very beginning, I think, thanks to the political piece of the story, that this was a community that wanted to be self-governed. So from the very beginning, there was a resident council, which still goes on today. And the other piece is that there was a whole array of things we had to do. Local ordinances were very unhelpful for allowing churches, which by federal law can do whatever they want on their property, allowing them to have such an encampment. And of course the excuses were all health and safety and all of that kind of stuff. So we had to one by one convince all the local ordinances to change the ordinances. And we became the set of faith communities that began to be serial hosts for this camp. The initial local ordinances were that the camp could stay with anyone for 90 days, and they had had to move on. And so every 90 days, we were breaking camp and helping the residents move to ultimately, I think 6 churches in the neighborhood, in Olympia, 1 in Lacey, participated. There was a whole question of food. Over time, we understood that a lot of help preparation and providing the food was required as this camp kept going. And so a lot of people got involved that way by bringing food, sharing meals, and thankfully getting to know the members of the camp. Eventually we set up a system, or they set up a system, because again, this was largely coming from the residents themselves, to have a security system for the camp. That meant both putting a fence around it, not to keep the neighborhood safe from the camp, but to keep the camp safe. Folks in that situation valued their own private security, coming from that sidewalk or under that underpass where they, were constantly in terror for their lives. They felt that protection was very important, but it also meant providing hosts, folks to actually be on the host desk 24 hours a day for years, right through the night, right through those snows in February. That became required by the ordinances as well. But again, a way for people to come and get to know, spend time with, learn about, understand that these were really just our disadvantaged neighbors and nothing more. That really went on for 6 years at least. Eventually, in the last couple of years, they changed the period of moving to 180 days, so it wasn't quite as often, but still, each move was a tremendous impact, both financially on the faith communities who were supporting and the donations we were getting from the community, but especially on the residents, as you can imagine. And of course, we're talking about a chronically homeless adults who value their possessions, and the incidence of pack ratism in that community is huge. So each move was just incredible. We had, of course, NIMBYism. I'm sure you all know that term, not in my backyard. Locations of camp. Every time the camp moved to a new church, local ordinances required hearings and all that sort of thing. And you get all the local property owners and people worried about their children coming out to protest us our being there. And again, that was a place where the friendships we had built with city staff and local police became very important because they became our spokespeople. And the real truth of the matter was eventually we had people coming to meetings at the next site from the first site to tell them that when the camp came to the first site, things got better there. That they felt, the whole community felt more secure because these folks were watching, which was great. I've already talked a bit about the security. We had to convince our church insurance agents that homelessness was a good way to respond to our mission and be covered by existing insurance costs. And there was the generally growing cost of supporting the living room. Thank you. I guess it's time really to introduce Panza, because what happened was the faith communities recognized that there was a group of them involved in this and pretty much got together and said we need a nonprofit to cover all of this activity and to advance ourselves legally, so to speak. So Panza was formed primarily from the faith leaders, both lay and ministerial, that were involved. Eventually it has grown to include many more people, and I'll tell you about that. But the work there was to fight those local ordinances, and a big piece of that was that to bring along this constituency which was being built within the community, call upon the elected officials that we did know by name, and make possible for residents of the camp to come and speak for themselves. A huge piece. From the very beginning, when the first camp was on our property at the Unitarian Church, the dream was for a permanent site, of course, somewhere where they wouldn't have to be moving to. And initially that was a permanent tent camp. That was the vision as far as we went. But over time, the residents and Panza began to talk about a permanent site. And one where there would be even more security and more feeling of home, and definitely no more moves next to it. So the concept of Quixote Village came into place, a permanent setup of some sort. Initially it was not really well defined, but obvious challenges were where were we going to get money to do it, where would we do it, did we have enough support to make it happen, and did we have enough bodies on the nonprofit to be able to do it. And what happened in that case is we decided to add an accountant and an architect and some social service to our board. And eventually, just recently, we've got a county commissioner of major work. And that's sort of a personal good work for me, or good story for me, because about 5 years ago, we went to that county commissioner to say, change the ordinances to allow for tent camps in the county. And she burst into tears because she could not believe that a tent camp was a viable solution to part of our homeless problem. And refused to help. And she's now the one that's on the board. The site, eventually the county became the player behind that. They said, we'll help you find a site if you're going to build something, do the nonprofit. And they scoured their available land and in fact found a piece of a 2.17 acre piece of land that they weren't using and had no plans to use in the light industrial section outside of town, but still within the city limits. But being out of town brought its own problems with transportation and so on, which I can talk about if I have time. So we found the site, and you can't really see it down below, but it was a pretty awful piece of land surrounded partly by a fence between a Pepsi bottling company and a piece of city property, county property on the right. But this vision of homeless units came out of the residents themselves. They, from the very beginning, were part of the design and planning process, and they wanted their own individual units. And it became obvious that we weren't going to be able to build big enough ones to have everything enclosed in those units, so the idea of a community building as well. And we can keep going with this. So as the design developed, based partly on the size of the site, we pretty much understood that we could only do about 30 units. And 30 was the number that Camp Quixote, the number of residents in Camp Quixote that had been going on for a while. And eventually we came up with a price tag of about $3 million. And looked, fortunately on the board was a woman who, a colleague of mine who'd been working in the state government for years, been writing speeches for governors, and so therefore knew everybody. And before you knew it, we had a $1.5 million grant from the State Housing Trust Fund coming our way. We got in line for CDBG grants through HUD money through the county and city, and we got this land basically for free, $1 a year for 41 years, and other forms of support, including in our part of the world, very significantly Native American tribes who are political and monetary players of size in our community. Okay, so everybody got involved in the design. We had wonderful architects. We had a developer called Community Foundation, incorporated that works in Washington State, whose job is developing low-income housing for nonprofits, and stepped right in and did wonderful work for us. We found a builder who was on the board of the Salvation Army. Everybody was helping, and everybody got into the design. And on June 2015, in the next slide, we broke ground on the site, and as I say, we got the temporary occupancy permit that December, just in time for Christmas. So we made the last move and started moving in just in time to have Christmas Eve in the cottage. Part of the story is that when it came time to contemplate the move, we, that being the residents and Ponza, got together and said, what kind of community do we want to have there? And the idea of it being self-governing was sort of given. But prior to that, there hadn't been, other than the residents saying that there would be no use of drugs and alcohol in the camp, there had not been a lot done to talk about the goals for the individuals there. And when we decided to build the village and move on, the residents themselves came forward and said, we want to have our goal to become clean and sober. And so, as we developed the plans for the management plan for the village and got staff who were capable of dealing with those kinds of issues, that became the residents' goal. It's proving to be harder than they thought. And we've only been open for 4 months, and already we're starting to have kinds of issues that will probably result in evictions, because the standard that they set for themselves is but our approach is to do whatever we can do to support them in that quest and to keep them on the track that they have set. Tiny cottages, they're hard to see, but they're in 2 lines of 15 running down towards the community building in the back. The cottages are 144 square feet inside, and that includes a half bath. Basically, when they arrived, they got a single bed with drawers underneath it and a desk and a stool. Inside the cottages, there's fire suppression and heat and all of that sort of thing. So it's just a tiny home. The community building is about 2,100 square feet with commercial kitchen, laundry, living room space, fireplace, and additional showers and baths. So they're showering and so on in there, and offices for our staff and so on. And sort of entertainment space. Our operating costs we estimate to be at about $2,200 a year, and a significant portion of that goes to staff. But a lot of it is for utilities. We're providing full utilities to everything except cable. We're going to give them Wi-Fi, but if they want cable, that's like they're on their own. Next slide, please. So the part of the design that the residents insisted upon was having a front porch. And you all are blessed with lots of sunshine up here. In Olympia, it comes in bits and pieces, and you want to be on your front porch for it when it happens. And they knew that. One of the huge pieces was a mailbox. There are folks who have not had their own mailbox for so long, and that component of being at home was huge. It has been huge for them. Down the lower right is part of the inside of the community building. It really took a village to build a village. I want to go back to the idea of building that constituency. The steps we had to take to make this kind of response a piece of the larger picture in our community. It did take us 7 years. I hope it won't take everybody else 7 years, but that's the true story. And it was building that through the staff, the residents themselves, local elected officials, that's our congressman on the right, and all the hundreds of volunteers in the community. This is, of course, just one component of our community's response to homelessness. All the things you've been talking about. Perhaps we're not getting such a hit from gentrification, but everything else is true. Here's one of our residents. I would just mention that, like your community homeless, about 3/4 of ours are men over 50. We also have a blip of younger people in their 20s, this being one of them. We have one house per person, because of the source of fundings, policies, we have to follow that. Everybody has their own cottage, but in fact, couples can happen and do. And in that case, they can share one house and have the other as an extra space. But again, it's only 144 square feet, which is about from here to there and about that long. It's pretty tiny. We do have the whole place is ADA accessible, including 2 cottages that are bigger in order to accommodate wheelchair access and that sort of thing. I wish I had taken more pictures quite recently because gardening is happening all over the place. Each resident has his or her own small plot, and those are mostly going into flowers in front of their cottages or grass. But then there's also a quite large area set aside initially for a workshop, and so the guys are getting a little upset that their woodworking place is not happening yet. But it's now a beautiful, intensive gardening area.